Hello, welcome back to our podcast, What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And as usual, I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy.
And Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. So we're back for kind of a part 2 episode.
Yes, and I really appreciated Caitlin helping us with that first journey into the medical assistance in dying in Canada. And today we wanted to follow that up with a talk between the three of us and our own experiences with people who have chosen the path of MAID. Also to talk about our own experiences with families and friends in their grief of that experience as well. And again, I want to just assure our listeners that we come to this because this is a legal way to die in Canada. And our podcasts are not making the judgments of whether it's right or wrong. Some of you may have opinions of that. But as a legal way to die in Canada, we want to explore those things because that's the reality of that we're dealing with in our society. And we want to be aware of it and to make our discussions something that can be helpful and informative and ways that you can approach this if it comes up in your family or in your circle of friends.
So Caitlin sort of took us through some of maybe the more mechanics of it, some of the the steps and the processes. But I know that the three of us have had sort of different experiences. We've done our own reading. And so I'm just wondering from you guys, what are some of the things that you are seeing when you are speaking with people who have experienced the medical assistance in dying of a loved one?
I think the first thing that comes to mind, and this came up in our episode with Caitlin, was that many of our clients will go through the process of a MAID assessment, but not necessarily choose to die by MAID. And I just, we've already said that, but I just want to emphasize that again, that sometimes that's part of their death journey. And that's part of how they are working through coming to terms with their diagnosis, prognosis, with their death. And so, I've journeyed with many clients where that the process ending in MAID was not the focus. It was more that the option of the assessment was something that they felt like they needed to do.
And I think that's a common piece that we've experienced. And I understand that. I think, for many people, the idea of dying, even if they say to me, I'm not afraid of death, the dying process is what really creates the challenges and the fears and the anxieties. And so for many people, I agree with you, that choice of MAID, whether or not they follow through with it, is that assurance that, if things get really bad, or if I can't take this any longer, I know what's going to happen. So there's this this piece around the death that also almost gives them that ability to step back and not worry about it, which is interesting because if we realize that every method of death, every way in which a person dies has implications, both in the dying and in the grief, then this as a brand new, and we've talked about that, a brand new way to die. It's not like any other death. What does that bring? And I think you've just said something important, Julie, that one of the things it brings to people that I've worked with in that is that bit of sense of, okay, I know that death, I know the time, I know the point, and so I can control my dying, not just my death.
The dying process.
Yeah. It's having it in the back pocket. Yes. I've heard that phrase before. I just want it in my back pocket. Something, and it's funny. So there's that sense of I've got control now. So someone has sort of handed me the keys. And I am going to now drive the car. And that sense of when I get to this certain level of functional ability, that's when I'm going to say, this is when I want MAID. And they get there. And I've seen some people realize in this sort of scenarios, Well, it wasn't as bad as I thought in my mind. This is actually more tolerable than I had imagined it to be. And so they push their date out a little bit and give themselves a little bit more time. And I think that control, the promise of control, allows people to sort of give up a little bit of control at the same time. That sense of, well, it's not so bad at this point where I thought I would never want to live at this level of functioning, and they get there and they realize there's a lot more to do in life. there's other things that are fulfilling, that they're getting from life and giving to life, and they realize, okay, now I'm going to adjust.
The other piece that I was thinking about in terms of medical assistants dying as a way of dying is that often people use this to protect what the end of life might look for them. And I think that if the legislation is going to change again, which the push is on for the inclusion, as Caitlin talked about last time, the inclusion of MAID in an advanced care plan, then people who have a dementia or Alzheimer's and who are afraid of losing control of their physical bodies will have this option in their pocket, as you say, Red, to protect how they look and how they are presented in the world to others. And so I think that is a new way, a new piece of dying, that now people see this as a way of controlling not just their death, but controlling the pieces of their dying and to decide when that's going to end for sure.
Do you think they see that as controlling not so much their dying, but their living? Like if it's dementia, if that's sort of the the condition, that I want to control how I live, and I don't want to live in a state where whatever X, Y, and Z the person finds intolerable. And so in that regard, it's controlling their living as much as it is controlling their dying.
That's a great comment, and I think you're absolutely right. That's what they're doing, and so they're living how they look in their living, or how they are in this world in their living.
Right.
Is something that they feel they can control by death.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I don't want to say too much more about this, but it's so interesting because, as you said, Red, what we observe, what our clients have taught us, is sometimes as their dying process goes on, what they once thought was intolerable, or, as Caitlin said, maybe they set a date, or that's a marker, when I can't take care of my own personal hygiene, for example, that is when I would do MAID. And I've had clients say this, and then they come to that point and they've had experiences moving into that all of a sudden they don't like it, but they can now tolerate it. Right. And so this is less of a comment about MAID, but more just the process of dying and how it changes us. And we're different as we move through the process, just like we are any significant process in time of transition in our lives.
And that speaks to the idea that I can never know what I'm going to be like until I get there.
Yeah.
And there's this sense where I think that's why I have always encouraged clients along this path to say, let's just do this one step at a time. You've made that ultimate choice of, I think I'm going to have medical assisted dying, but there's a lot of pieces to get there. But let's just take this a piece at a time, because you don't know what it's going to be like. You have an idea, and sometimes those ideas are worse than the reality. So let's take this a step at a time. And if, as we talked about last time, if we get to that place, as you said, Red, and this isn't too bad, we know that now. We didn't have the ability to know that before. So this is very much still a step-by-step process in this.
Yeah, and I've said that to clients, and you don't need to know if you want to die by MAID. You can decide, your decision, if they go into the assessment process, is to do the assessment, right? And just to your point, David, it's a step-by-step. So you don't need to make up your mind right now. And even as Caitlin was saying, you can make up your mind and you can change it. You can set your date, you can change it. And, I remember her comment saying, how she has said to patients, and nothing would delight me more if you decide when I call you, I want something different or a different date, right? So it's an evolving process. Let's talk about what we've noticed in the people we've supported. And we've all done some work reviewing the literature and the research on this. what are we seeing where the person has gone through the MAID process, is moving towards a MAID death? What are we noticing about the dying process for those that are choosing that and for their family, their support system?
I think the concept of the support system is an important piece because the decision for MAID is so individual, but it affects every larger system, family, friends, all that kind of stuff. And so having that sense of who is the system is really important. But some of the things like that I've noticed, I mean, I know some people who have had a MAID death, and everybody thought it was a really nice death and a very appropriate way for that person to leave this world. In that situation, though, everybody was on board. Everybody sort of was of the same mind. They sort of, I don't know if the right word's approved, but they were in agreement with this, that this was right.
There was alignment.
There was alignment. Thanks, Julie. And so in that situation, that death, and it seemed to be the type of death, that sense of control that was indicative of that person as they live their life. Mm-hmm. And so everything would seem to be congruent and aligned. And in those situations, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of issue post-death other than grief. Like, it doesn't seem to be all that complicated afterward. But there are some situations where alignment isn't right and a total agreement is not there. And I think that's when it starts to become something that we will see folks struggling with more and having difficulty with. And I can come up with some ideas, but I'm going to pass it over to David because I'm sure you have some things to add.
Well, in my in my experience, I think that and while working with palliative clients towards their death, we always talk about what do you want that death to look like. I mean, there's always that piece. However, it seems to me that MAID introduces another choice, another decision that needs to be explored by family and others, just like you have said, Red. So now we have two big decisions. We have the decision of MAID and the decision of death itself. So it adds a layer there that we do need to pay attention to. And again, I think the greatest challenge in the dying can be that incongruency with family and not just family, but friends who unfortunately seem to have something to say about everything, maybe, and sometimes those voices get really mixed in. The other piece about this, and I hesitate to raise it, but it's true, so I think we have to face it, is that in some people's minds, that this is a moral decision. So for some people, that decision then plays into, who can I tell? Who do I want to know that this is how I'm going to die? And so there's this difficulty that arises in being able to sometimes be honest about that. And I think that's true in the death and the dying. And we'll talk about that in a moment, certainly in the grief. But I think it's present out front because there's sometimes that challenge of, I don't know if I want so-and-so to know about this, that I've chosen this. So all of those pieces can be present and I think we can work with them all, and we have, I know we have, but it just adds a layer there that I don't think sometimes we're not conscious of.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of a couple scenarios where so I've had this scenario where Red mentioned where everyone was in alignment. There was strong congruence. I've seen where there was alignment in terms of the family members maybe wishing the person wouldn't choose MAID, but out of love and respect for their choice was saying, we're going to support them and I'm not going to say anything. And then the scenario where the person is choosing to die by MAID and where there's lots of different feelings and opinions. And as you said, David, maybe moral debates going on in the family, or feeling like we need to protect that information from that aunt or that cousin or that neighbor. And then that becomes a whole other piece for the family and the support system to carry. And of course, for the individual that's dying, if they're aware of it, they're now carrying a whole other piece during a very difficult, vulnerable time.
Yeah, and it's the stigma of that whatever it is, whether it's a moral judgment or an ethical judgment or whatever, that stigma and I mean, I think the things that we've experienced in our own sort of experiences are sort of borne out in any of the literature that we've read on MAID. But a lot of the literature and a lot of our experiences will speak to this concept of the stigma that's attached to this type of death. And then that sense of disenfranchisement that can come for people who, they've got to keep now a secret, maybe from a certain family member or a minister or whatever, because now there's some kind of secret about this death. And now it's their responsibility to sort of own that and carry that somehow while they grieve.
Well, they grieve, or they're even already they're approaching the death date, and I've seen that. And wow, like the weightiness of, so now not only do we have this feeling of the countdown, which we haven't talked about, but that can be a really hard time for the family and the individual. They've picked the date, they're sure about their date, and they're watching the hours and the days go by, and they're feeling every minute and every hour of that. And then imagine if layered on top of that is, and the people in my world, I'm also not telling them that, that my spouse is going to die next Thursday because of this stigma. So that then becomes this whole other piece to that. Mm-hmm. And I've watched and witnessed people carrying that, and it is a tremendous pressure. Yeah.
I've watched someone go through that and flip that right in front of me in terms of it's all very supportive, conversations are good, and then a thought, or you could just see it flip, and it's sort of like, but I'm not sure if I'm ready. I know that this is something that we're going to not be able to tell people, and then come back, but I'm still supporting, and consciously sort of having to make that mental gymnastics almost of saying, I'm going to support this person whom I love, and I'm going to carry the weight of me not being able to be open and honest about how I'm feeling, about what's happening, and now I've got a secret.
One of the other pieces of this that I've thought about, it's taken quite a while for me to process that, but I wonder if there isn't this return to death in a much more naturalistic way, and obviously I don't mean naturalistic in process, but in the scenarios that we create. So, my great grandparents and earlier, death happened in the home. That's where death took place. So, the death and the wake often happened in the home. Then we had the medicalization and the funeral industry, and death became something that happened in an institution, hospital, long-term care, and then the funeral industry cared for the body, and we became detached from that. So in a sense, because when I talked to people about to MAID, the vast majority began with the idea, I want it to be at home. So we have this sense of, I want my environment of death not to be an institutional environment. And so MAID is one way of controlling the environment of our death. And I know it's, Caitlin said it's harder to find, the providers to do the amount that want it in home. But that is one of the big, in my experience, people who want that procedure, that MAID, are asking that be done in an environment. If it's not home, then can we change the environment in a hospital room setting or somewhere where we can make death more home-like?
Yeah, and I certainly read about that in the literature and in the research that was one of the things that family members after the MAID death were commenting on is, if you will, an advantage of MAID was feeling they could do some of that preparation. They had control over how that death could look, and in a way that felt really congruent. Again, there's that word for the family and the support system. So, as Caitlin mentioned to us, she's been present at deaths where there was a large group of people. I've had clients where there were very few people there. There's been some scenarios that maybe feel a little more almost celebratory, and then of course many that feel very somber and very serious, and everything in between. But to your point, David, it's that like control of that choice,
right? And the downside of that, and I think we need to put this out there, is that the downside is that sometimes the person who is proceeding with MAID or their family feel like we can make this easier if it's celebratory. So we want it to be, very positive, and that's good. I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but I think we have to recognize that when you leave that room, somebody has died, and there has to be some aspect of sadness that person is not there. So I think it's, again, we've talked about this many times, that if we try to have totally this emotion, it's a failure. Whether that emotion is joy or sadness, it's not one or the other. I think we have to allow for both to be present, and especially with individual family members, some of them may be feeling that sadness of that person's not going to be here more than other people in that way. So I think the difficulty is if we kind of feel like this, everybody has to have this joyous feeling while this is going on. I think we can celebrate the fact that this person has had a good life. This is their choice. They are ending life this way. But we also have to recognize that brings also the reality that this person is dying, and we will experience the sadness of that.
I think that raises an interesting or an important point in terms of preparation. What happens before the MAID event, and how do we prepare? Again, if everything is in alignment, then that preparation probably flows a little bit more easily. I don't know if I can actually say more easily, but anyway, it flows better. When things are not in alignment, then there's that disconnect. And so we read in the literature, they often talk about what was good about the MAID death was that I had the opportunity as an individual to say goodbye, to have that last visit, to be present in that moment. And maybe there were some tears and there was some sadness in that moment, but that was sort of like a gift. And I was there, and I got to have my final goodbye, and that's important. And we talked about the importance of the vigil, right? But if I'm not one of those people that can come to the bedside and say goodbye, and because I'm not in alignment with that, then that just keeps me disconnected, because then I don't even get to say goodbye. And I'm not there at the bedside, holding vigil and able to come in and visit, even though maybe communication isn't possible in the normal way. That's missing. And so how we prepare in the process is really important. And how do we get folks, how do we help people who aren't in alignment with the process? How do we support those folks? How do we support the folks that aren't invited to the day? As we were saying, the individual gets to say who's there and who's not there. What happens when someone thinks that they'd like to be there or isn't invited to say goodbye? I had a gentleman ask me the other day, how many goodbye visits can a guy have? Because everybody was coming to say goodbye. He didn't have MAID. He was not dying by MAID, but that sense that he was dying, and he knew it, and everybody was coming to say goodbye. And he just turned to me, how many times can I say goodbye? It's like I said, well, how many people are there? That's what people, the folks probably need that. But that disruption of being able to say goodbye, and I think how the preparatory phase is going to be so important.
I think that preparation, I think that's an important thing that people need to consider. And I think, we can put that out there. If I can share a personal piece, how MAID has one thing that it's impacted me on a personal level, because saying goodbye to somebody who's dying, and I've done that, countless times. But normally, the person isn't necessarily conscious when I'm saying goodbye, because I have, I'm in the end, they're sedated, or they're not necessarily responding, very end of life. So it's a very one way. It's what I'm saying to that person. But when I've had clients who are choosing MAID, all of a sudden now I'm saying goodbye and we're having this normal conversation, and they're able to respond to me. And I'm being very honest here, it really challenged me at first to know how to do that process. So I actually changed to where I didn't say goodbye to people. I said thank you to people. So I went in with an idea of, we've spent this time together. What have I observed in you that I want to just say thank you for? So it is a goodbye, but it was really a change for me to have that kind of dialogue in that end of dialogue, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I think both of you know that one of my first experiences with that, in saying goodbye to that person and then knowing, however many days later they were going to be dying by MAID, I felt like I carried those hours between the time I said goodbye and that so differently in me. And I can understand, David, why you had to find your way through that process of how you were going to do it, because it does feel differently, doesn't it? Yeah. And it's not a bad or a good, or it's there's no value judgment on that. It's just, it really, I was so aware that there was just something more for me to process.
And I think earlier on in MAID, where people were choosing to do it early in the trajectory because of the fear of losing cognition, that was the piece, right, where we were saying goodbye to people far earlier than we might have under normal circumstances. So I know our time is moving quickly, and we have so much to talk here, but I really want to be sure to bring in some pieces around the grief and what is the challenge, or not challenge, but what is the difference in the grief piece? Again, I come back to what we recognize in our work, that how a person dies doesn't have to be bad or good. It impacts, in many cases, it can impact the grief. And so if MAID is a new way to die in Canada, then how does that impact grief differently than any other way of death?
I think that I'm going to take that one step back and then move forward again. But I think there are some things that I've experienced that people have experienced and told me, that the process of MAID, you talked about that quite often at the end with that, when the death is not by MAID, that it's a one-way conversation. It's a one-way goodbye. And one of the things that I know post-death was complicated was that the individual was alive, and I was talking to them, the person says, and then all of a sudden, like, we were laughing and having conversations, and then all of a sudden they were dead. And it was a shock. Mm-hmm. It was like they didn't realize it was going to happen that fast, and they went, how did I go from just having a conversation to now they're gone? And in that moment, in that really, really brief moment of time, that shock was shattering. And then the other pieces that I often hear are, it happens really, really quick.
Yes.
And no matter, and they'll say, and I don't know if someone told me that, I'm sure they told me that would happen, but I didn't get just how fast it would happen. And then the other pieces were, and they changed color. Yeah, they changed, but they sort of weren't ready for that, right? And then the other piece and I couldn't take my eye off the needle. Mm-hmm. I couldn't it was the only activity in the room, and it's all I could look at. Mm-hmm. And so the focus became the procedure as opposed to the person. So they went from being very much alive to being very much dead, and the images that were left were a fast change in color, the speed at which it happened, and the needle. And then that affected the grief afterward, because that's all they could think about. Right? It was a traumatic event for that person.
Yes.
And as a result, grief was somewhere in the back of the bus. It wasn't in the front of the mind. It was, I can't get over what I just experienced and witnessed.
That's certainly been my experience as well. And, you know, before we started recording tonight, we were talking about, we have to remember that the people that have sought us out for grief support around MAID are maybe those people who have found it particularly challenging. And of course, we know that there's people who maybe who didn't struggle with some of these things. So I do want to just respect that knowing that, you know, maybe some of our experiences are a bit skewed one way, but certainly the families that I have supported have reported very similar things, Red, around the suddenness, that reckoning that the brain has to do. Like, I had dinner with them last night, or we had breakfast, or we had this, or we engaged in this fun little activity, or did something really normal. Like, we were sitting there texting. And then now 2 hours later, they've died. And I think back to one of our earlier episodes about the value of the vigil. You know, one of the things we talked about is that vigil can help us kind of step down slowly towards a place of going, and now there's death. Where the MAID death, even though they know it's coming, they know the needles, you know, all that, it can still feel very sudden and
it's
jarring.
It's almost like an accidental death.
Yes.
Or an unexpected
unexpected
death.
death.
I was just thinking that.
Even though it was planned, you know, there was no more planned death than that. But it had the effect of almost being like an accidental or unexpected death.
So I know my work, thinking of a few clients I've worked with, is almost just helping the brain process that moment. So then, as you said, Red, they can go on to find the grief in the back of the bus and they can move into their grieving. But it's like, but they're kind of stuck there in that jarring series of events, trying to almost, you know, work through their own reckoning of that.
And that's absolutely true, Julie. And I found that too, that the grief work is moving them to the relational pieces of that person. But we have to get beyond that first piece. And for some people, it's not a problem. It's an issue. For other people, it can be very much a very dramatic piece that really is a blockage that needs to be worked through. So there, and again, we know, and we've talked about this from the beginning, grief is going to impact everybody in a unique way, differently. So I don't want us to impose this idea that everybody's going to struggle with it.
No.
But at the same time, I think the reality is it might happen. And just to know that piece, it's okay. You're not crazy. But we do need to take care of that, because that will get in the way of allowing us to deal with the relational pieces of the grief.
And I must add, for the folks that I know, they've all said, though, when it comes right down to it, if we had to do it again, I'd do it again.
Right.
Like, it wasn't like they were kind of going, that should have never happened. It's no, I'm still in that place where if we were put in that position again and I had to go through that again, I would do it.
Right.
So it's not a regret.
It's
just really hard.
Yeah,
It was a unexpected, jarring challenge.
And so that's why I think the preparation is so important, and how people get ready, because then that can save some of that sort of traumatic experience or traumatic response if people are well informed. And I don't know how you can all be 100% ready, but in preparation, I think that's important so that people know what's going to happen. They know what to expect. They have lots of opportunity to ask questions, and be informed.
And the piece that I've found, which brings us up, is that sometimes family members believe or think that because the death is made and this person has chosen it and everybody's in agreement, it will make grief easier. And, I always say to them, a way a person dies impacts your grief. But on another hand, it doesn't matter how they die because they're not here. So the reality that they're not here happens at death. And it doesn't matter how that death happens, you're going to feel the absence of that person. So grief, people feel like, oh, it's going to be easy. I'm going to skip pieces of my grieving. That's not true. Again, that's the preparation that I think is really important. And the other thing I've observed in the grief, and this can happen, it's interesting. I've had it happen a number of occasions, either around the 3-month to 6-month period, where the person will want to talk to me again. And I remember them saying, I know that this is what they wanted, and I was full agreement, and I'm so glad, and I would do it again. But I just wonder if we could have had more time. And so there's this feeling of, and especially earlier on where people were choosing to do it early, we could have had more time. And so that piece, and then they quickly come back, but I know that's what they chose. And so we live, even in a positive way, we live with this dissonance, that kind of, did we do it too early? Could we have had another day? Could we have had another month? And it's funny how that shows up sometimes 3-6 months down the road.
And I think that concept of wanting more time exists no matter how the death is.
Exactly.
But
that's grief.
But the control and the death being a decision puts a different spin on the concept of time.
Yes.
Right? I think when anybody dies, we wish that we had more time with them. Right? And I've heard that statement, and I go, so what would, let's say MAID happened a month later, how do you think you'd be feeling now? And they'd go, well, I'd probably be wishing I had more time. And it's like, yeah, that's a never-ending want. But the fact that the date was chosen and the time was chosen, I wonder what kind of spin that puts on that desire for more time, because there's the sense, well, there could have been more time. Whereas if the death was not by MAID, there can't be more time because the body quit of its own accord. And so that question then becomes, yes, I wish we could have had more time, but we couldn't. Whereas MAID is, well, we could have. And there will be always that lingering sort of spin on that concept of what more time is.
Yeah, and thank you both for bringing this up, because I feel like you were reading my mind. I was thinking about this, and I really like your comment there, Red, is because sometimes that is speaking from their place of pain in their grief. We could have had more time. And so I like that comment of, and how would you be feeling if they had done it 2 weeks later, right? Well, I we're still going to be aching and longing and, sad and missing them. And so that was going to come no matter what. And I want to go back to what you were saying, David. I've so witnessed that too, where there's been this surprise about the intensity of grief because we were all in alignment, or we felt like it was a very peaceful death and we know it was what she wanted or what he wanted. And so therefore, in some way, and we got to say our goodbyes and we had our important conversations and I felt like we had closure. And so then they'll say to me, I just didn't expect to feel this bad. And it's kind of like, well, that was for that. But you were always going to grieve, and you were always going to long for them and miss them. And it's, we see the same thing in other forms of death, where the person will say, like, I knew they were going to die. I thought I'd already done my grieving. Yes. Right? We hear that a lot. And I think of in the residents at hospice, I've heard actually family members say, like, I think I'm going to be okay with this because I did my grieving a long time ago, and then the person dies, and then 3 months, 6 months later, they're kind of shocked by the intensity of that. And it's like, well, you can't grieve for what you haven't lost. Mm-hmm. And so we can grieve along the way for the losses along the way, but we can't grieve the loss of the person until they're dead.
Absolutely.
So the concepts of control, alignment, and dignity aren't necessarily buffers to our grief.
That's right. Grief is a natural reaction. Yeah. It's a natural response.
Yeah, they're distinct and stand on their own, right? And so the death might have been something that where people felt in control and people felt in alignment and people felt that this was an appropriate death for the way this person lived their lives and who they were or whatever. But it doesn't mean that that your grief is going to be lessened because they're gone.
Yeah, there might be other components that feel lessened, like it was very peaceful.
Right.
I can take comfort in knowing that they didn't suffer. Right.
I had a good last visit and got to say goodbye.
Yeah, so we can
He was surrounded with love.
Yeah, so that can provide us some comfort that we carry with us, that I think can help us carry our grief, but it still doesn't change that we will grieve.
Right.
And that I've said this to clients too, who you may have the control of the death was a very helpful piece, but you can't control grief. It controls you, and that's not a bad thing. That's just what happens. And when we get into trouble when we try to control grief, as if we can control that. So I think that there's so much here, and I really do recognize that we've just touched the surface, but I think there's real value. I think the conversation needs to keep going. I think that I really appreciate the idea that preparation is important. I think helping people understand this, whatever the experience will be, is really part of the dying itself. So we have responsibilities there, I think.
Yeah, I think it's important to face this as a new way of dying and not just run from it. And so we have to be mindful and careful and attentive to this as a process and learn through these processes, right? And I love I'm so glad you brought that up, Julie, that, I think a lot of people get focused on the death, but then don't focus on the grief and think that the positive focus of the death will somehow buffer them from that grief. I think if it's done well, there's opportunities for the grief to be less complicated, certainly, and if preparation is done well. But I think it's right, Dave. We've got to keep this conversation going. I hope that we've had a conversation here tonight that was open to MAID as an option, that we weren't sort of one-sided or the other, that we were trying to have a very open and candid conversation about something that is the reality for people in Canada, that we need to face and we need to come to terms with and figure out how we do this and how we do it well. But it's going to be different for every person, because no matter what, everybody's death is different, because everybody's death is their own personal death.
Yeah, and I just want to say that because it is a new way to die, and we're learning, right? Like I'm learning in how to support families and individuals in this, and I want to just take a moment to really honor those families, because they've taught me a lot, and my ability to sit here tonight and even speak about this is not from the literature. It's from my experiences of being invited into these sacred places, into their homes, to have these conversations, both, in the preparation of the death and after. It's been a real honor.
I spoke with somebody, and they were very clear that they wanted their death to be by MAID. They wanted the assessment started. They weren't at a place functionally. And I looked at them and I just said, so what does it take to make that decision? Because nothing, like, talk about a death-denying society, nothing like turning toward it and saying, I'm embracing you. In fact, I'm inviting you at this time on this day. And they thought about it for a long time, and they went, a lot of personal and internal fortitude to say goodbye on my own terms. And I went, wow, it wasn't a flip answer. There was a moment of contemplation, and it was just, it's going to take all my strength to make this decision and to do and to go through with this as my death.
And I would agree with both of you that it's the people that I've journeyed with who have taught me this, and I'm so appreciative of their depth of thinking and commitment to working this through. I have not worked with anyone where it was a flippant decision. I have appreciated and explored with them, and they've been very kind to let me do that, to get into that process with them. What is it that drew you to that? Why is that important? When will you think that will be important? So they've allowed me to do that with them. They've been very helpful. But those are the things that teach me and have taught me. So I'm appreciative, and I agree. This is our open and honest conversation.
I'm so glad you said that, David, because in all the reading, that's one of the things we haven't sort of covered, is that, it's not a flip decision by people.
No.
It is a decision that has taken time and serious contemplation and a lot of thinking and, a lot of weighing, and it's not done lightly.
Right.
And that bears out in the literature. And we hadn't got there, so thank you for putting that in there at the end. I hope the end.
Thank you.
Thank you
for the beginning of this conversation, which will continue to evolve.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced